As I said, it's a real pleasure to welcome Jaleesa Trapp to be, joining us and talking about purpose. And as you know, Jaleesa is now a PhD student in our lifelong kindergarten group. But I've known Jaleesa for many years. She doesn't like when I say how many years. I first met Jaleesa when she was a member at a computer clubhouse in Tacoma, Washington. So there's our clubhouses, a teen summit where young people from clubhouses come together. I first met Jaleesa when she was one of the young people from her clubhouse who came here to Boston. And then kept in touch over the years. She ultimately later became the coordinator of that clubhouse. And is then a high school teacher, and then has been here at the Media Lab as a graduate student for the last few years. But I thought Jaleesa was a great person to come to talk on this week about purpose, because I think it's something that's both driven her, and then she's thought a lot about how to both study it and support it in others. But before we get into it, so we have the word purpose, and different people might think about it in different ways. When you think about the idea of purpose, how do you think about purpose?
I think about purpose in a few different ways, but especially within the work that we do in lifelong kindergarten, I think a lot of times people get tripped up on the word play. And I don't think that people understand that play can lead to purpose. And so, having those skills, being able to play also allows you to be more confident in working on things for a purpose. So like personally, when I was going to the clubhouse, I learned how to code because I worked on a project called What If There Were No Black People? And I was really interested in it, and I was playing at the clubhouse, and I made this interactive CD-ROM. But the purpose behind
So that also gives you a hint of how long ago it
was. The purpose behind it really drove me to keep adding to my project and keep making it longer, which then, I became very skilled at this. So I was making interactive CD-ROMs for pretty much anything I could. Instead of like doing an English paper, I would be able to create something.
Say more about that project on, what if there were no black people?
So it was based on a play that I had seen and had been a part of, and it was just highlighting the inventions of Black people in the United States. And so it was just showing like how we would move about our day if we didn't have those inventions. And that was something that I was really interested in because my mom only bought books and movies by Black people. So that was like something that I really knew. And so I wanted to keep making this project because it was actually the first time that my mom realized what I was doing at the clubhouse instead of just like playing on the computer. So, showing her that she was really proud of something that I made, and it was also something that she could show other people. Another example that I give of like play and purpose is Joy Bulamwini, who is a graduate of the Media Lab. She was playing around with facial recognition technology when she realized the bias and the harms that it causes. And now she's doing a lot of great work.
Some of it was designing things and it just didn't recognize her own face.
Yeah,
so it was very personal thing.
Yeah, it was very personal, but the way that she discovered it, it was because she was allowed to play with that technology. It wasn't because somebody said, hey, you have to do this, but she was able to play and she discovered a bigger purpose, and she's doing a lot of great work with that.
Yeah, I know I sometimes think about it also, as you say, it connects to play in that way. It relates to passion, but so a lot of times you're passionate about a purpose, and if you have something that you really care about it, that change that you want to see, you do become passionate about it. But passion can go in different directions as well. So I remember when we were first coming with Scratch, there's a childhood friend of mine who's now a lawyer in New York, who's been very active in the gay marriage movement. And when I showed him Scratch, he first saw that they were just sort of kids making cartoons. You can only see it as kids making cartoons. And sort of, why are you spending your time doing this? And it was only when he saw that they could also use it for a purpose that it really was meaningful to him. And Yeah, although at least I would think that kids have different pathways, and sometimes making a silly cartoon can be a way to then find your purpose later. How about, so I know it definitely, you were driven by it as a clubhouse member. How did that influence you later on? I guess it was after you went to, you went to college at University of Washington. Was it after you went to college that you then became a clubhouse coordinator? Well, okay. So you then were coordinator at the clubhouse. How did that then influence the way you thought about your role as a clubhouse coordinator?
It definitely influenced the way I was a clubhouse coordinator and also as a high school computer science teacher, because the way that I was allowed to play and to be able to define what was purposeful and meaningful to me at the clubhouse was not my experience at school. At school, it was very much, do not touch the computer. If you are touching the computer, you need to work on this and only this. And I'm gonna come around and check to make sure that you are on task. Where I walked in the clubhouse and it's like, oh, what do you feel like working on today? Like, what do you wanna do? And that was something that I had never been asked. And if it wasn't for that experience, there's no way that I would have gone to the University of Washington. Or I interned at Microsoft when I was in high school, and that was because of my experience at the clubhouse. Other students that were there, they got to learn coding at school. My school did not have that. And so I really wanted to make sure that the young people at the clubhouse had the same experience that I did, and not the same experience where I want them to do exactly what I did, but have that experience of being able to find out what they find meaningful and what they find purpose in, and also to be able to play.
Now, so you brought that to the clubhouse, where there is a lot more flexibility in the way that you can organize things in the clubhouse. You then had a job as a high school teacher, teaching computer science, right? In high school, at least that was one of the things you were teaching.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are a lot of constraints there. How did you bring about these ideas to your work as a high school computer science teacher?
A lot of times I just didn't tell them.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different constraints teaching within a public school. I was fortunate enough to be at a school that was an innovative high school. And I was able to talk to my admin and say, hey, this actually doesn't work. And their response would be to do what you need to do. Just make sure that they get what they need to get out of it. So I was very fortunate in that sense, but a lot of other teachers are not, especially when the class is maybe 50 minutes. I was fortunate enough to teach at a school where my class was 90 minutes, so I had a lot more time with my students to be able to do this. But a lot of times I would just have to try things out and say, hey, look, this worked. And then they would say, okay.
Do you have some examples of the type of assignments? I know the type of assignments you would give to enable them to work on things that they really found purposeful.
So one project that they worked on, they were actually creating games in Scratch. But they were also learning about physical computing, and so we had makey-makeys available to them. We also had, the company is called Bear, but it was conductible paint, so they could draw pictures. And so one kid was using makey-makey, but he didn't have anything conductive that he wanted to use, and so he started making Play-Doh. And my admin walked in with a bunch of visitors, and they just walked up to him. They were like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm making Play-Doh. And they were just like, why? Because it's a computer science class. And he's like, because it's conductive, and I need to connect it to my makey-makey. And they were just like, okay. And they're like, we'll leave him alone. But my class was always very, very loud. I had to fight to get laptops. I had to fight to get tables so that students could easily move around. I had to fight to get whiteboard tables so that they could write their ideas down on the table and be able to move and take pictures and things like that. Even though it's an innovative high school, there's still a lot of very traditional things within the classroom that I would have to advocate for, and just have to convince them to trust me that it'll work. And it did, but it's a lot of like fighting on my end to get that.
Actually, maybe connected when you talked about you're helping work with high school students learning Scratch. One of the things you've done here as a graduate student is to look at the type of projects kids are creating in Scratch and seeing how it might connect to these ideas of purpose. I know you've worked on this with a few others. I know Cicely Sadler, who's also from Lifelong Kindergarten Group back there. I know you worked with Cicely and Paulina at Harvard Ed School. Maybe you can talk about some of the things you've done and looking at ways in which kids have used Scratch to connect with purpose.
Yeah, so as a master's student, Paulina and I talked a lot about purpose and what we were seeing on the Scratch Online community. And we talked about it in terms of this is something that's already happening. A lot of young people are creating projects about things that they really care about. And how do we highlight that? And how do we show people that this is also something that's important? So we started calling it the 5th P as we were looking at the different projects, because it is something that's really important. I don't know like how in depth some of you have looked at the Scratch Online community, but you will see a lot of different studios about things like Black Lives Matter. You'll see something about disability justice. Like you'll see so many different things, and it's young people working on projects that they care about. And I think that you have.
Yeah, so maybe we'll show the video too. We do have a video that captures some of the projects that young people worked on in the Scratch Online community about Black Lives Matter. So we'll show that video. And again, this of course just one of, as you said, one of many things. There's a lot of things around environmental issues and other social justice issues. But certainly in the last few years, this has been a lot of young people. But again, this is not sort of that there was a big, assignment across the Scratch community. This is something that sort of rose organically. And then some people in our group, including Eric Schelling, who's back there, sort of interviewed several of the young people who have been creating these projects. And that's what you'll see in this video.
The Black Lives Matter movement is to say that Black lives matter as much as other lives.
All people should be treated equal, and no one should be mistreated just because of their race and color.
Most people already think that white people matter. You don't need to say it.
Basically what it says, Black Lives Matter. Since I've been old enough to talk, it's been in everyday life. I feel like they shouldn't be treated this way anymore.
I realized that I needed to make a stand for this. I should at least do it for myself too.
My Black Lives Matter project starts with the fist that stands for unity and strength. I wanted to raise awareness, and because what happened with George Floyd, and not just him, what happened to other people in the past and present.
I just saw that the community was doing Black Lives Matter. I was really proud because finally I could actually show people that I cared about it. I was in a virtual protest of Black Lives Matter.
My Scratch project about Black Lives Matter is like a normal platformer, but the different thing is that Scratchers can learn about Black Lives Matter while playing the platformer.
The theme of my project is unity, and it's to say that in 2020, the most important thing is to remain united.
I was a little nervous because I thought some people will start arguments in the comments, and I thought some people would just ignore it. When people started to actually remix and put in their own twist, I realized that a bunch of people actually cared.
I saw a lot of projects being made about Black Lives Matter in all sorts of ways. There were like poems, there were arts.
When people are seeing your art, maybe you can change the way they see the world.
It doesn't matter what your age is, because Sometimes when you're younger, you're braver.
I can be a part of change and I can also make an impact on the world.
I hope that Black lives don't get treated the same like they do now. I hope that they actually do matter like they're saying.
Something to add about the work that myself, Paulina, and Cicely have been doing. What we've been doing is taking it a step further and creating ways for educators to actually have conversations about the types of projects that young people are making, and also creating activities to help them get started in making projects like this. Because sometimes young people are making projects online, but that's the only outlet that they have. That's the only way that they're having those conversations. And we want to help better equip educators to be able to have those conversations, especially because these are things that young people are actually going through. And so if the only place that they have is online, it's a good place, but also they need to be able to actually have these types of conversations within their learning spaces.
Actually, one thing I was thinking about just in some conversations I was having over the weekend, we were talking with some people in an organization and who were sort of setting up for kids to be able to work on projects. It wasn't necessarily with Scratch, but other tools to deal with sort of these big global issues. And clearly that can be valuable, but sometimes I feel it can be, just as important and maybe sometimes a better entry path if you talk about sort of things that are more local to you. So maybe you could talk about the role of purpose with connecting to important global issues and also connected to very local issues.
Yeah, so I think that like my role as an educator is not to place a burden on young people and say, you need to solve world hunger, or you need to come up with a way to solve this. I really want to support the ideas that they already have and things that they're already passionate about. And what I've found through the clubhouse, through teaching, through workshops is young people already have things that they care about. And most of the time it is something that's local. It's something like, oh, well, on my street, there's a bunch of potholes and I want to figure out like, who do I talk to get that fixed? Or there's a lot of trash and pollution in this area and I don't know how to keep it clean, things like that. There's a lot of things that they already care about. And I think like my role as an educator, as a facilitator is to cultivate that curiosity and help them with their creativity and how they want to go about solving it. But if it is a global issue, that's also fine. Because some kids do say like, oh, I care about ocean pollution. That's perfectly fine. Like I still think that my role in that is to support them and coming up with the creative solutions that they have. But I don't think that I should come in and say, today we're gonna talk about making sure that every kid in America has food. Like I don't think that that's not their burden.
As you were saying, part of it is telling you how do you set up an environment where young people can find the things they do really care about and then follow up on it. I know one of the ways that you set up that type of environment is by engaging the young people themselves, whether it's in a workshop or an extended class over a long period of time, in sort of developing the community, what the community is going to be like, what guidelines there are for the community, what are the values of the community. Could you talk a little about that, about how you sort of create that space for them and work with them to create that, to help them create that space?
Yeah, I think, well, I know the most important thing is creating an environment where young people actually feel comfortable talking about what's important to them. Because so many times, especially just like you think about your elementary, middle school experience, like you walk into a classroom and somebody says, these are the rules. Nobody consulted you, you just walk in and these are the rules, these are the expectations. I think it's really important for me as an educator to say, hey, you know, what are things that you value? I want to make sure that I'm honoring your values and that you also see that other people in this classroom share values, or maybe even have some different values, and that we all honor those. But also, what are community guidelines that you all want to set so that we are all treating each other the way that we want to be treated in this space? And it's something that we can agree on and hold each other accountable for, which includes me as the adult. And that definitely, it shifts power in the learning space, and it also creates an environment where there is trust and comfort. And so there are like some guidelines that I always add, even if the young people don't come up with them themselves. And one of them is to trust other people's experiences, even if it's not your own. Because I really want to make sure that there's an environment where if somebody is working on a project and it's about the Black Lives Matter movement and they want to talk about something that they've experienced, that they have the environment where they can do that and they don't feel like they're an outsider, they don't feel like they can't share that. And that's something really important when talking about purpose. I can't expect young people to just come in and just tell me all about, you know, what happened to their cousin and why they're so passionate about this one topic if I don't have an environment where they feel like they can actually share that.
Actually, one thing as you were saying that, it occurred to me, in the readings for this week, we read the paper by Rick Rose and Shai Mindu and Sasha with their review of civic engagement in the Scratch community, which relates to the things that you and others have been looking at, civic engagement related to purpose. And I did find interesting in that paper, they talk both about kids talking about issues in the world, like environmental issues, but also issues in the Scratch community, and how they want to be agents of change to sort of build a better community. And I think it reflects a little bit of, as you were saying, that for kids to be able to talk about things, whether it's Black Lives Matter or potholes in the local streets, they also have to feel a sense of comfort and pride in the local, you know, community that's being set up. So they're also sort of addressing that with a sense of purpose. How can we create a good community for myself where I'll be able to do these other things? So I sort of think there are those two levels at work.
Yeah. And I mean, so the activity that we'll do later with community mapping, it looks at just that, you know, like what are things that you are proud of about your community? A lot of times things are addressed as just a deficit, like what do we need to change? What's bad about your community that you want to change? We need to solve this, we need to solve that, instead of actually starting with, what do you like about your community? What are you proud of about your community? Like what things bring you joy about your community? I think that's just as important as the things that you want to see changed, because there's a reason why you're still like identifying as part of this community, because there are things that you like about it. So how can we take an asset-based approach at creating change?
Maybe one last thing I was going to ask about is a new initiative at the Clubhouse Network that you've been involved in helping to organize and facilitate, the Youth Activism and Advocacy Initiative, which is trying to support opportunities for young people at clubhouses. Maybe you can explain a little bit more about the motivations behind the initiative and some of the things that you're doing now to help support it.
Yeah, so within the Clubhouse Network, activism and advocacy has a long history within the network. You can go to different clubhouses and see the different types of projects and things in the community that young people are working on. But it had never been formalized until last year. And one of the really big things that we're doing with this initiative is we are supporting the adults who are supporting the youth-led movements. I think a lot of times as an adult, it is hard to let youth lead. You want to say, oh no, don't do that, or have you tried this, or have you thought about that? And so what we're doing is really working with, we have 10 different sites where we're working with the adults who are supporting these projects and really helping them. One of the workshops that they're going to do next week, it's really focused on youth can. So looking at the assets, like what can youth do, and what is my role as an adult to support them in doing that.
And right now, they're like, they're sort of grants given to like 10 different clubhouses around the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know if we talked, there's now like 120 clubhouses or so around the world. You had to call for proposals, and there's like, 10 different clubhouses will be supporting these efforts.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is not to say there's not things going on in other clubhouses, but it's
We
really
only
a
have
focused
money for
effort.
10.
Yeah. But hopefully that can also help inspire others in doing it. A few questions that are overlapping with one another, so maybe we can combine a few together. At least two that I think maybe do connect with one another. There's one here that says, how do you spark marginalized children to action when they're scared to speak their ideas out loud? How do you build that safe space? And I think that's somewhat related to another question. When a student feels like they aren't ready to share or aren't used to being vulnerable in a classroom space, how do you take small steps towards building trust? Actually, who wrote those questions? Do you want to elaborate?
I wrote the first one you read. It was kind of based on the comment you made before about building a safe space to let them speak their ideas out loud and kind of like not putting anything on the table, let them tell you what they want to do. And I was just thinking, well, I used to be a very, very shy kid, and you would not make me talk at all until like somebody else was doing something. I would just join even if that wasn't my idea of what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So I was really interested in how do you create a space where like marginalized children who like really don't want to talk because they have had bad experiences by talking, how do you create that safe space that allows them to eventually come out of their shell and really tell you or just to spark into action what they want to do?
And just check, the person who wrote the other question want to say, I think you had to.
No, just along the same lines, like, I think the other bullet that someone else wrote, like, freedom can be friendly.
Yeah.
I think just, similar line of thought.
And I wrote a similar question just to ask if you could give an example
Yeah.
of exactly what this said.
So I'll start with an example. So one year I was teaching a class, and it was actually the inspiration for my master's thesis. And it was called Infiltrating Spaces, Uncovering Hidden Figures. And so what we were doing, so I was co-teaching with two other teachers, and I think we had maybe 30 students. We were looking at our community, we were looking at like what is purpose in the community, but then also looking at examples of people within our community and other communities who have done inspiring work. And one of the things that we got to do is we got to take kids on a field trip to Microsoft. So Microsoft is only 45 minutes away from the school where I was teaching in Tacoma, but none of my students had ever been there. They didn't even know where it was. And after that field trip, there was a girl who never spoke in class. She waited until everybody else left, and she came up to me and said, "Thank you for taking us to Microsoft. I really enjoyed it." And then, so the next day, one of my answers to that question is journaling. So even though I taught a computer science class, we had journal entries every day, where my students could write about where they got stuck, or I would have a prompt and they can use the prompt, or they can just use their own. But in my computer science class, we did not touch the computers until after our journaling time was over. And that's also where they could ask me questions if they didn't feel comfortable asking out loud. But so in her journal the next day, she wrote about how she never thought that Microsoft was a place where she could work until we went there and she saw that there was a place for somebody like her who really enjoyed English, but she could still work at a tech company. So for me, that was a win. The other part of that is sometimes it takes time building that trust within young people, especially me teaching high school. You have kids coming from middle school where I always say middle school is like a regime. Like they're like 3-minute passing period, only walk on this side of the hallway, don't do this, don't do that. Like the science classes are crazy. There's more rules than learning in my opinion. And so sometimes it takes them a while to get used to coming into a space where I'm like, hey, what kind of guidelines do you want to create in this space? But I'm very intentional about a few different guidelines. So one, trusting other people's experiences, even if it isn't your own. And then also creating a brave space. And I talk to young people about my classroom or my learning space being a brave space. A lot of people talk about a safe space, but I can't always ensure that what somebody else says is gonna make you feel safe. Because if Mitch says, I'm gonna slap you, Jaleesa, like I'm not gonna feel safe. But if we create a brave space, I can be brave enough to say, hey, that's not right, or not even just me. Other people in the classroom can feel brave enough to speak up and say, hey, Mitch, you probably shouldn't do that, you know? Sorry. But so, you know, like really being very intentional with the type of space that you create. And also, you know, and so sometimes we just shorten it to be brave. And so sometimes that looks like a student saying, hey, I've talked a lot. Is it okay if I ask my friend here to speak up? And if you don't want to speak up, if you want to whisper it or write it down, then I'll say it out loud for you. Like I've had students do that before. But really making sure it's a space where everybody can be heard and making sure that there's multiple ways for them to be heard, because it doesn't always have to be out loud. If they want to write it down, if they want to talk to me about it after class, then I make sure that they know that all of those options are available.
Okay, we'll go on to a question that's a little bit more about the overall system and how this fits in within the overall system. So it says, how do you balance appeasing the system that requires specific tests or outcomes with allowing students to follow purpose and choose what to work on? Does someone want to acknowledge that they wrote that?
That's me. So I think, I'm sorry, I was lost in thought and what you said about bridges.
Okay.
No, yeah, just like I'm going to a really structured place next. And I think I really struggle with how to integrate this creative learning space and this, you know, seeking your purpose and passion with also appeasing the system that I'm in. And you started to talk about that and having to kind of fight that system, but just maybe some tips on what kept coming up for you as ways to push back.
Yeah, so it is hard, especially, I know that if I was in a different.
But Coy comes from West Point, is that right?
Okay.
And Jaleesa comes from a military family, is that right?
Also from Seattle. Love the Mariners story.
Okay. Yeah, I was born on Fort Lewis. So.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, it's hard. And I understand that. I come from a military background where I had to make my bed every morning, and yes ma'am, no ma'am. And so one of the things, and it kind of goes with the last question too, I'm very honest with my students. I usually start class the first day with saying, who wants to be here? And some people raise their hand, I'm like, raise your hand if somebody made you come. Like, if you didn't even sign up for this class, but you ended up here. And kids are, I'm like, it's okay, raise your hand. I'm like, sometimes I don't want to be here either, it's fine. But just like letting them know, like, it's actually okay that you don't really want to be here, but you're here, so what are we gonna do to make the best of it? I tell them that about teaching. I don't really want to have to like give you this test or have to do these things because I know that you're brilliant already, but these are things that I kind of am required to do. But how can we make this better? So one of the things that I do is I actively have students participate in creating the rubric. So that there's transparency and they know what they're being tested on, and it's not a surprise because I don't like surprises in general, but I don't want to give them like a pop quiz because I don't think that's fair. I don't think it really measures like how smart they are or their knowledge. So I include them in those processes. Sometimes there's curriculum that I'm given maybe 2 weeks before school starts. So it's like, this is the new curriculum that you're supposed to teach. I will straight up tell students, like, I actually don't really like this activity. Let's talk about why this is a good or not good activity. And I know that like me teaching high school is different than if I was teaching elementary students, but given the fact that I'm working with high school students, they're old enough to understand that. And so we actually just talk through things. And so they understand that these are things that may not always be right, but this is what the district requires. I also talk to them about things that they've worked on and how can this fit into these requirements. So you made this wonderful Scratch project. Does it fit all of these requirements that the state wants you to know? Does it? It does. Or if it doesn't, okay, what could we add to make it fit those requirements? So you already know what you're doing. You're already smart enough. You're already doing all the requirements that they want. You just did it in a different way, and that's okay.
Maybe we have time for like one more question. I could take another from here, but is anyone sort of motivated to ask a question? One that's really on your mind? Should we just take one more from here? Yeah, go for it.
I was just having clarifying the explanation of this question, like the other questions as well. I'm from India. Using English language is quite difficult. We have 22 scheduled languages across the country. Whenever we speak English, kids think that, oh, they have to learn English to learn tinkering. Okay, and that actually takes a lot of kids away from the experience of tinkering. So, in your experience, in your opinion, what or how can you decouple creative expression from the language of transaction?
That's a good question. So I always tell other educators, like, so were they able to create it or not? Like, what is the way that they do it? There's several ways to do things, and that's okay. When I'm doing Scratch, use whatever language makes sense for you. Like, it doesn't have to make sense for me. I want to see like the outcome. I want to know about your process. But if it makes sense for you to use Scratch in your native language, then please do that, because I want you to be able to create and not get caught up on semantics. And which is why Scratch is such a great learning tool, and which is why even as a high school teacher, I start out with Scratch, because we can get caught up on, oh, I didn't add a semicolon, so now all my code is broken and nothing works. Or we can connect coding blocks together and it works just fine. And if something doesn't work, it's easier for you to see why it didn't work. I think that, unfortunately, there are a lot of educators that will think that there are certain requirements to being creative. English being your first language, or being an expert in that language is one of them, unfortunately. But I've taught Scratch workshops to kids who do not speak English, and I did not speak the language that they speak. Actually, I went to Belgium, and when I was in Belgium, I spent 2 hours in a classroom with, I think they might have been about 4th or 5th grade. one kid did speak a little bit of English, which was like Michael Jordan and Beyonce. But we worked on Scratch projects and I did not have to speak another language in order to facilitate that workshop. Their teacher was there to help translate when they had questions, but I think it's unfortunate and it's disheartening when that type of thing happens because that's just another barrier to creative learning.
Actually, this did remind me of just certainly also we always encourage kids to, when using Scratch, use whatever language you're most comfortable with. It's one reason why we've been active. There are now more than 70 languages on there because we want to support kids that way. But one of the former graduate students did a study on this, Shai Mindu, who was also one of the co-authors on the paper you read about civic engagement in Scratch. I forget the details of it, but he looked at kids who were programming in Scratch using their native language versus ones who were doing it in a second language. Because there are lots of schools around the world where English is the second language, and the schools introduce Scratch and they see it as a good way for kids to learn English. So they tell them they have to use English in Scratch, and they think that they're sort of both supporting their learning Scratch and also supporting learning English, which they think is a good thing. So, and Shai Mindu found the same thing when he looked at the data. And so I forget exactly, but I think he looked at the projects done by the kids and looked at the variety of different programming blocks they used and some measures of the creativity of the projects and diversity of projects. It was much higher when kids were programming in their own language, in their first language. So we have data to back up Jaleesa's intuition there.
Like, I'll use a translator if I have to. I will figure it out.